morning, and while we're still waiting for one more panelist, just a reminder that this session will be closed captioned. This feature is available by clicking the closed caption icon at the bottom of the Zoom application. A transcript can be provided upon request. Attendees, your mics are muted. Please submit questions or comments using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom application. Your name may be read aloud, so please let us know if you wish to remain anonymous. Again, waiting for one more panelist. We'll be getting started soon.
Adam, are you teaching right now?
I am, yeah. I'm teaching a couple of classes, really enjoying them this semester. So it's been nice. People seem to be making the best of the very difficult situation.
Okay.
Well, that is wonderful,
Yeah.
Adam. And I want to hear all about your classes, but because Angela is here now.
Hi, folks. I'm sorry.
Good morning. Good morning.
Had a little moment, but we're good.
It's okay. Welcome. I'm so excited to see all of you. Feel free to introduce yourself, send shout outs in the chat. Just a reminder that this session will be closed captioned. This feature is available by clicking the closed caption CC icon at the bottom of the Zoom application. A transcript can be provided upon request. Attendees, your mics are muted. Please submit questions or comments using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom application. Your name may be read aloud, so please let us know if you wish to remain anonymous. Tabby? All right, if you wish to remain anonymous, let us know when you put your question in the Q&A. You can add that to the end of your question. Tabby, are you here with us?
Hello.
Good morning.
I'm here. I'm sorry. I was not included in the panelists. Is my video available?
We can see you.
Oh, okay, I can't see everyone else. So Technology. I'm still learning. It's been a whole year in, but we're all still learning together. With that, I will start us up this morning and just move quickly so that we can get to the main events. My name is Tabby Chavis, and I'm the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity, an associate vice president for research, and a professor of education and psychology here at the University of Michigan. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first event in our dialogue series, Forgotten Bodies, Conversations on Research and Recognition. NCID's mission is to produce, catalyze, and elevate diversity scholarship. Our developed framework for diversity scholarship defines it as scholarship that helps advance our understandings of processes and phenomena related to areas such as difference, inequality, culture, identity, oppression, as they impact individuals, groups, institutions, communities, and societies. Our catalyzing mission area includes bringing together interdisciplinary communities of scholars to support research, engagement, and innovation. Area includes making the important contributions and legitimacy of diversity scholarship and diversity scholars, and supporting the dissemination and application of this scholarship, and informing and addressing critical societal issues. Today's event, the first in our series, Insisting on Immigrant Belonging, 46 and Beyond, will be a conversation about immigration policy enforcement and possibility in the United States. NCID is thrilled to welcome an exciting interdisciplinary group of diversity scholars to lead us in this conversation on research and recognition. Please help us build this and other NCID programming by completing our post-event survey sent to the email you used to register for this event immediately following our conversation. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will now turn the program over to Ashley Woodson, my colleague at NCID's Assistant Director. Ashley?
Thank you, Tabby. The title of our series is borrowed from poet Claudia Rankine's declaration, "I am invested in keeping present the forgotten bodies." Each conversation provides models of relevant, necessary research that resists past patterns of exclusion and expands our sense of community. We invoke those words and the words of today's dialogue leaders as an act of remembrance, saving space for those whose lives and words are not fully acknowledged, but nonetheless directly inform our efforts today. We are indebted to their sacrifices and hope that our time together inspires new avenues of honor, restitution, identity, and justice. Representing our conversation on social media is Ronnie Alvarez, born and raised in Southwest Detroit, home to a large and vibrant immigrant community. Ronnie plans to graduate from School of Public Health in April and hopes to continue to do research addressing the health impacts of immigration enforcement and policing more broadly. Thank you for your facilitation, Ronnie. Please follow us and Ronnie at UMichNCID and represent this space using the hashtag Forgotten Bodies. Now to introduce today's dialogue leaders, Angela S. Garcia is a sociologist and assistant professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. Her book, Legal Passing, Navigating Undocumented Life and Local Immigration Law, compares the effects of restrictive and accommodating state and local level immigration laws on the everyday lives of undocumented Mexican immigrants in the United States. Adam Goodman teaches in the Department of History and the Latin American and Latino Studies program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His award-winning book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants, traces the US government's systematic efforts to terrorize and expel immigrants over the past 140 years. William Lopez is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and the author of the book Separated, Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. Dr. Lopez is a longstanding friend of NCID. And Jean Guerrero is an award-winning investigative journalist and author of Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. Her writing is featured in Vanity Fair, Politico, The Nation, and The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, as well as other publications. Full bios are available on the Forgotten Bodies website, and check out Ronnie's tweets to follow and advance the work of our guests on Twitter. Jean is serving as our moderator. Let's welcome her framing remarks.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be with you guys, helping to lead this discussion, and it was a real privilege to read these books. I feel that under the Trump administration, we really saw an oversimplification and reductionistic tendency when it comes to talking about immigration stories, whether it's in journalism or just in our everyday lives. And reading these books really puts the issue of immigration and the violence of immigration enforcement into the full, historical perspective, how we are all implicated in the violence that is perpetuated against non-white immigrant communities. So I really sincerely recommend that everyone read these books. If you haven't read them already, they're all going to be staying with me over the course of my reporting on immigration. And I wanted to start with William Lopez, his book Separated. I had been covering immigration under the Obama administration as well as the Trump administration, but because so much happened under Trump and things just got so extreme, that I personally and so many other journalists, it's almost like we developed amnesia for what had been happening under the Obama administration. And so reading Lopez's book, where he reminds us about just the horrific separations that were happening during the mass deportations that we saw in that era, it's an incredibly important book. And one of the lines that I go back to again and again in this book is, quote, "It is the everyday potential for catastrophic violence that allows for the coercion of entire marginalized communities." So William, in your book, you draw these really important parallels between what happens in immigrant communities and what happens in Black communities. You draw these parallels between the violence of ICE and the violence of our police departments. So can you talk a little bit about why you felt it was important to draw those parallels and address the question, is this really about more than just immigration?
Sure. So thanks so much for reading, first of all, Jean, but also for a great question that really cuts to the heart, I think, of what I was writing about, what many of us were writing about. So just briefly, Separated follows what happens after a raid that occurred, as I describe it, on a Thursday in November of 2013. And this is a raid, for those of you going to school at U of M, this is in our community, right? This is in Washtenaw County. As I was doing this research, I was also writing along with officers to see how officers talked about immigration enforcement. But this was in 2013, 14, 15, during the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is when Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, this is when they were killed, right? So as I was thinking about immigration, I was also thinking about the violence in Black communities, extrajudicial killings by police. And I saw how the language used in each of those communities is often very the same, very similar. So the way in which we vilify undocumented folks and the way in which we vilify members of African American communities, which therefore cast them as dangerous, which therefore justifies the violence against them, was fundamental in what I was seeing. And just briefly to your question, Jean, we often, I think, publicly focus on these moments of hyper-violence. So we focus on, as I did, admittedly, but I'll talk a bit more about why I did that, these moments of the raid or the deportation or the killing. As well we should, but it's often at the expense of all of the slow unraveling that happens behind those events or the history that leads up to allowing them to happen. So the way that I describe it in the book is it's certainly about that event that happens on that one day, Thursday in November of 2013, but it's also about the fear of that event that exists for the other 364 days of the year.
Yeah, one of the most powerful things about your book is really painting a picture of the toll that takes on these communities, on a daily basis, people just being afraid to drive their kids to school or to go get groceries, just this constant state of terror and this feeling like they could be separated from their children at any moment.
Right. Yeah, and so we see that behavior changes can extend from that fear, right? So we certainly look at the behavior changes and the health impacts of a raid and of a deportation, but often what we miss is how different people go about navigating their communities because of that fear, whether or not they're the target of police action, whether or not they're the target of deportation. And I know you'll get to this later, but I learned a lot about these behavior changes also from your book, Angela, from how we change the way we appear so that we don't appear as a member of a criminalized group.
Exactly. Yeah, so Angela, I wanted to turn to your book, Legal Passing. I mean, it included some very evocative examples of, you know, after a raid, for example, there was a 24% increase in babies who were born underweight, specifically to Latina mothers. And, you know, this reminded me of Lopez's book, where he talks about a mother, you know, after the trauma of the raid, it actually cuts off her ability to breastfeed her child. Like that very you know, vulnerable connection between mother and child is severed by the violence of the immigration raid. And so, Angela, you talk about some of that, but then you also talk about how this quote unquote legal violence manifests in much more subtle, insidious ways in the community, you know, changing the way that people walk, changing what they wear, particularly in places that have very restrictive local measures like Escondido, which is one of the main characters in your book, this city in San Diego. So can you talk a little bit about what you learned there, and also like what is this concept of legal passing that you describe, and that for me was very much captured by this anecdote in your book where this mother decides to name her son Scott, which like she has a trouble pronouncing. It's a name that's very, very difficult for her to say, but she, you know, she finds it important for her son to be perceived as belonging. So anyway, can you talk a little bit about this concept of legal passing?
Yeah, thanks, and good afternoon. And Billy, you kind of set me up very nicely there with your comment. So thanks for that. So, you know, a part of the answer to that question, Jean, is sort of flipping the traditional question that we ask in international migration studies, which is why do people leave, to the question of why do people stay, and why do they stay, and how do they stay in places that are trying forcibly with violence to push them out by forming hand in glove relationships between ICE and the police, by passing ordinances that say that you can't rent an apartment if you're undocumented, or a multi-generational family can't park more than one car on a public street, or you can't solicit work on the corner if you're a day laborer. Why do people stay in these places, and how do they stay in these places if they're in a vulnerable immigration state? And so I think, you know, why people stay is partially, you know, obvious in that people are tied by the jobs they have, by the familial and social connections they have to a particular place. And because also of what people call escalating commitment. So much has been sacrificed from leaving a community of origin, in transit, violence that is often experienced. And then when you finally arrive to a destination, it's very hard to then make the decision to go on a secondary migration to maybe a more welcoming immigrant destination because of these sacrifices that were fundamental to getting people to where they are. So then the question is, if you make the decision to stay, how do you stay? And this was what I arrived at in the book, and was not at all what I intended to research when I set out to do this work, but was about doubling down on life in restrictive destinations and staying by changing your behavior, your material consumption, even the ways that you think over time, because of this effort to pass as someone who is not suspicious, as someone who's a citizen, as someone who is American as possible. And what that means is what I describe as legal passing. And so I think that there's a nuance here between what I'm describing in the book and what a lot of us, both scholars and in the media, have latched onto, this narrative about people living in the shadows. And I want to push back against that in my book, in part because you can't live in the shadows for too long. You know, if you have to go to work, you have to take your kids to school, you've got to get to the laundromat, you have to get to the grocery store. There's no way one can survive living in the shadows, unless we're thinking about the most extreme form of that, which might be taking sanctuary within a place of worship, for example. And that requires a whole village of people to protect you. So people stay by attempting to blend in and pass, not call attention to themselves. And that requires a real fundamental violence to one's own being, abandoning a language, or changing or altering the name that you might have given your child so that they don't stick out as a Hispanic first and last name, but rather a non-suspicious, quote unquote, American name. And of course, this has a lot to do with race and ethnicity and class woven through. But these are just some of the ways that I get at talking about the kind of everyday violence, that slow violence that Bill suggested often is under the layers right before a big event like a raid or the election of an anti-immigrant elected official.
Absolutely. Yeah, that legal violence, I mean, even in non-immigrant community, or like even in documented immigrant communities, like that, this imposing, you know, expectation for assimilation manifests in like people losing their ability to speak Spanish and just having their connection. Like this is something that happened to me. You know, I English became my dominant language when I went to school in San Diego. You know, in the 90s, back when there was a lot of anti-Mexican hysteria and attacks on bilingual education and this idea that you had to speak English. And so I remember thinking like English was, you know, or sorry, that Spanish was bad and that I had to stop speaking Spanish. And so English became my dominant language. And so, you know, you can't even imagine like what undocumented immigrant communities have to go. It's like a exponentially more severe experience. And that's what you capture in your book in Legal Passing. And Adam, I wanted to turn to your book, Deportation Machine, which it's so important, like putting into historical context the violence of this deportation machine that we have, you know, how the deportation of Mexicans and Central Americans parallels the historical expulsion of Native American peoples from their lands, the forced emigration of the free Black population, the horrific treatment of Chinese immigrants in the 1800s. So your book really illuminates the repetitive nature of history and how over the years we have used coercion as a, quote, basic governing strategy, as you write in your book. And so I wanted to ask you, why is it so important to have that historical perspective in mind, and what does it teach us?
Well, thank you so much. You know, and thanks to all the organizers. It's really an honor to be in discussion with you all today. And, you know, there's so much overlap in, I think, our interests, what drove us maybe to write our books. And I'm looking forward to getting into that a little bit later. But I do think that, you know, historians, you know, have something to bring to this discussion because there's so much resonance, you know, of what, you know, Dr. Lopez and Dr. Garcia talk about in their books in past decades and even maybe a century ago. You know, so my book traces the long bipartisan history of anti-immigrant politics and efforts of local, state, and federal officials, and sometimes even ordinary citizens, to force, coerce, or scare non-citizens, and sometimes legal permanent residents and citizens out of the country. And this is a long history that I trace over the course of nearly a century and a half. But I also want to emphasize that I'm very interested in uncovering the history of people resisting and fighting back, which they have at every step of the way. But a couple of things kind of caught my attention as I started scratching the surface of my research and getting a little bit more into the quantitative data that I was able to compile. And one is that 57 million people have been deported from the United States during the last 140 years. That's more than any other country in the world, right? During the last century, during the last 100 years, the United States has deported more people than it's allowed to stay on a permanent basis, which raises all kinds of questions about the mythical reputation of the United States as a nation of immigrants, a nation that's welcomed immigrants throughout its history. And it leads me to the question that begins the book, and that is, what kind of nation is the United States? You know, another important point, you know, and something that overlaps certainly with the coercion that you know, my co-panelists discuss in their work as well, is that the vast majority, about 85% of the 57 million deportations have happened through expedited fast-track mechanisms. Euphemistically referred to as voluntary departure, even though there's nothing voluntary about them. And the way I've come to think about it is that deportation without due process has long been the American way. And I think that that's worth discussing, and perhaps we can circle back later to strategies of how to combat that and fight against that. And just two other things that stood out. One is that Mexicans disproportionately have been targeted throughout U.S. history. They represent about 9 out of 10 deportees, and I think that's had an extraordinarily harmful effect, obviously, on individuals and families and communities, as both Angela and Bill uncover in their books and their work, and the real effect that it has on real people, which is so important for us to understand. But it also has, I think, harmful effects in creating broad stereotypes about who is an American, who is not, who is belonging, or who belongs, who does not, who is deserving, etc. And the idea that Latinos have come to represent the prototypical illegal alien, in quotes, that is something that I think the disproportionate targeting of Mexicans and more recently Central Americans has helped to create and solidify. And it's worth thinking about that. Thinking about the fact that 95% or so of the deportations today come from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, those 4 countries. Right? And I think that that's something that we should be thinking about. But the historical continuities are important to recognize, as well as moments of change. And I appreciate the opportunity to be in discussion today about these topics. And I'm really just looking forward to digging a little bit deeper and engaging with the questions later as well.
And Adam, quickly, can you just give a brief description of what voluntary departures are? Because this fits perfectly with the idea of coercive governing strategies. But for people who don't understand, I mean, you mentioned that it's not at all voluntary, but the reason that the reason it deprives immigrants of their due process rights is because of the fact that it's like the opposite of voluntary, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the deportation machine, as I describe it, is composed of 3 mechanisms. Formal deportations, which most people are more familiar with. You might imagine kind of a judge in black robes presiding over a case, even though those have also become streamlined more recently. Those have only really become numerically significant in the last 20, 25 years or so, after 1996. So the vast majority of expulsions have happened through voluntary departure. And what I liken voluntary departures to, the best way to understand it perhaps, is they play a similar role in the immigration enforcement system as plea bargains play in the criminal justice system. It's the best of all of the horrible options presented to someone after apprehension. Right? I emphasize voluntary departures is, they do not consist of someone deciding to pick up and leave or return to their home country because of threats, which might be part of a broader self-deportation campaign, which I also trace, and I know that Professor Lopez and García also examined. But voluntary departures happen after apprehension, and people are threatened with long periods or perhaps indefinite detention. They're threatened with multi-year or even lifetime bans on re-entering the United States if they're formally deported. So in order to avoid those harsher consequences, they agree under coercion to leave the country supposedly on their own, even though I pretty strongly emphasize that this is under direct threat from government officials.
Exactly. And then before I turn back to Bill, I wanted to pose a question to everybody, and please just jump in with any thoughts that you have about the role that the media plays in perpetuating these stereotypes that promote anti-immigrant policies, that promote systemic violence against immigrant communities. It's a topic that's very much on my mind as a journalist who has been in a wide range of different newsrooms and different news companies with different values, some progressive, some more conservative. And I've noticed that regardless of the political leanings of the newsroom, there are always these insidious tendencies to reinforce white supremacist stereotypes. Reporters being asked to run background checks on their immigrant sources when they're not ever asked to run background checks on our white sources. I know that's something that's happened to me. I remember one time I was writing a story for a newspaper about problems of violence that were being triggered by the presence of multinational mining companies in Indigenous communities. And it was going to be a page 1 story for a newspaper that I won't name. And then the page 1 editors decided to squash it, saying that, you know, these are innately violent communities, and that the idea that the multinational mining companies were in any way to blame was unacceptable to them as a premise for the story. So these are just constantly, like, because of the lack of diversity in newsrooms, the people who are framing our national conversations and our narratives are often doing it the wrong way. And that's where I think that work like yours is so important, all of the time that you guys spend in these communities. And so can you just talk a little bit about like what you think journalists have got wrong? Like, what can we do better? And what do you see your role as, you know, academics, scholars who have overlapping interests in these topics and trying to, you know, also address these issues?
Sure, and I'm happy to start too. I want to maybe later. I have a story about voluntary departure, Adam, that I want to come back to, because I think voluntary departure is something talked a lot about, or at least experienced in communities, and I'd never read it from a academic perspective. So your work really helped me understand what for me was a very emotional thing that I had been witnessing. But for the moment, back to Jean's question, what is the role of the media? And what are the role of academics? And I think, you know, Jean, you said it's a lack of diversity in newsrooms that may lead to the single, you know, kind of myopic story being told. And I think, you know, those are two of the keys. One is lack of diversity of the people telling the stories, right? So they're always coming from the position of the white academic, often position of a quantitative researcher. But also we tend to divide the world into binaries that make the story really easy to tell, right? So we saw that at the very beginning when we go back to the DREAM Act, in which the ideal undocumented immigrant needed to be a college graduate to join the military and be married, right? And we know that this isn't, I mean, it certainly applies to some folks, but it by and large misses the way real people live. Not everyone is high achieving and nevertheless deserve to be treated like human beings, of course. And the one that always sticks with me was President Obama's framing when he said we want to pursue felons, not families, because felons, air quotes again, are part of families, right? People are parts of families. The world is not divided into the criminal and the non-criminal. And I understand that those stories are easy and simple, but really do a lot of harm in these communities because they make us not ask questions about what kind of policies we want to have. They make us ask questions about what kind of net we want to catch or cast, right, to catch certain people. You referenced, Jean, the idea of, I'm sorry, you referenced, Angela, the idea of living in the shadows and how, you know, that's another narrative that we tended to wrap around our heads around. I like that you brought that up because it is something that I kind of describe after immigration raids. People will draw their blinds and hide. So I think it is very valid, but like we discussed in the beginning, it's not the 364 other days of the year in which this is happening, right? People in these communities live amongst this kind of pursuit that is often justified by these simple stories told by the media.
Exactly.
I'll jump in just to add a couple of things to that, though I you know, would underscore everything that you've just said, Bill. That it's easy for journalists and for academics. I want to be careful not to you know, sort of only say that media is getting it wrong and academics are getting it right, because we're not. That it's really easy to fall into these broad brush kind of tropes, and then there's this path dependency, and it becomes really hard to break out of these narratives that we're now familiar with, the good immigrant or the bad immigrant, or the hiding behind the shadows. And so I think, you know, in a general sense, and recognizing that this is a struggle, especially with media where you have a shortened kind of version of a story that you can tell just because of sheer, you know, word count limitations and page limitations. centering people's humanity at the same time as, and in doing that, centering their agency. But at the same time, it's really important to take a step back and look at the structures that are forcing the violence. And that can be a really difficult story to tell. If you start saying structural violence, you have to unpack that. And I can understand that it's a really difficult it's a really difficult thing to unpack in a short space. And so just to return to something that might seem a little basic, but I would reject even the premise that it's basic, is this idea of words and the power of language, and the ways that words matter can drive public attitudes, especially for media in this case that has a much broader public than most academics do, who not many people read our stuff. And that's our fault again. And so I'm thinking about, the Drop the I Word campaign, pressure on media outlets to stop using the term illegal to refer to people, and why that's important, efforts to replace alien with non-citizen, because of these things, because these terms are so dehumanizing and criminalizing, and also racially and politically coded, and kind of putting the onus on a person without looking at any of the structural things that are happening around how that person wound up in this space, without the ability to have immigration status that is a legal one.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That the language matters a great deal. And I think oftentimes the media has privileged the terminology of the government or the words and the terms that are on the books instead of how people identify or self-identify, right? I mean, how do people refer to themselves, not how do law enforcement agents refer to them? And, there's a long history of this where newspaper headline writers, studies done in the 1970s by social scientists showed that newspaper headline writers, and these stories included stigmatizing terms in 8 out of every 10 stories, or headlines that painted immigrants in a negative light. I remember even back in 2011, 2012, I was reporting a short story on the undocumented, unafraid movement, young people coming out across the country and engaging in bold acts of civil disobedience. And the movement is called Undocumented, Unafraid. And I was writing this up for an outlet, and I got through multiple rounds of edits, and the editor sent me a last draft and said, just one change. I'm changing all references of undocumented to illegal, because that's what the AP style guide says, right? And the institutional power there matters. But this is an area where we've seen some progress as well. The terminology has changed in outlets like the New York Times in many cases, or the AP. And I think that has an important trickle-down effect. That actually does matter a great deal. But deprivileging or taking some of the power away from those institutions and putting it back in the hands of the community and respecting how people self-identify, I think, is an important step.
Yeah, I think it was 2 years ago, or I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 years ago, that the AP style book actually instructed journalists, like, okay, when there's racist language, you can call it racist. You can actually use the word racist. Before, our hands as journalists, when we were following the AP style book, were tied. We had to use more polite language when describing racist rhetoric. We had to use terms like racial, whitewashing what was actually very blatantly racist language. So all constantly, being taught to give the benefit of the doubt to, white men, while being suspicious and demonizing of brown and Black men and women. And so anyway, this is something that Adam, your book touches on, like the penny press, like how this is like part of a long historical pattern, like the penny press doing like horrifically demonizing Chinese immigrants, and William Randolph Hearst calling for anti-immigrant measures. Like, just there's a long history of this, and we're just barely as a media industry starting to address the problems. And so William, like, family separations are not new. There's something that Americans became extremely upset about under the Trump administration, because there was this zero tolerance policy that was very visible, where clearly the people who were being targeted were not quote unquote bad hombres, the way that Trump likes to say. Finally, it was very obvious to people that these are real human beings, and it was harder for politicians to be able to continue to demonize them. But the reality is that it wasn't very different from what we saw under the Obama administration. It was different in nature. It was different in motivation. Like the Trump administration separations were very much motivated by white nationalism, by hostility towards immigrants, as I document in my book, Hate Monger. But William, can you talk a little bit about this double standard that exists, and this selective outrage that we see sometimes in progressive communities about these issues, and how it relates to your work?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to be clear, the separation of parents and children at the border in Texas was terrible. And, we will remember it in the US history as one of the most heinous things we've done, right? I was in Texas, I was in San Antonio at the time when the story broke. And I remember, being shaking and mourning for my people and for my state. So I want to absolutely emphasize that we should remember it. I'm glad you documented the reasons behind it and how like white nationalism was behind it. But I think you're exactly right. It was so visible and so contrary to the story of men being removed that we couldn't help but reckon with it as a country, right? So we saw often mothers and children very visibly separated in cages and in fences, right? And we had to confront it, which was a good thing. But it also shows that we are prioritizing, as we started this panel with, this visible hyperviolence, and also just ignoring the slow violence that happens, that may be a little more complicated, or that may involve people who are more complicated and more full beings, right? Who may have broken a law, who may not make straight A's, who may even have a traffic ticket or something like this, right? So qualitatively, the way in which separations occurred during Trump and Obama were different. And I do want to emphasize that some of Trump's strategies were, to terrorize communities. And we saw this in the return to large-scale immigration work raids that President Bush did prior to Obama. But when if you ask somebody has been separated from their family, whether they are, sad and depressed and miss their parent because it was a raid, or because it was a separation at the border, or because it was a traffic stop, they're going to miss their loved one just the same, right? In the end, the method becomes less important than the impact that it has over the course of these people's lives. And I think we see this also, and I'll bring us back to the discussion that we talked about with police earlier, is that this focus on the moment of killing, which we absolutely should do, but again, misses the entire system of mass incarceration, right? Which some of us are not willing to combat, or the fact that police can stop and frisk en masse, right? These are some of the norms that ultimately lead to the violence that people aren't willing to stand up against beforehand. Oh, sorry, and I missed, so your question was how this is different in political parties and how people may privilege one over the other. So just to get back to the question, right? So we see when people are much more active when they're opposing the opposite political party, right? And not looking inherently at the impact of the policy, no matter which political party is impacting that policy.
Yeah. And I wrote this op-ed recently where I think I mentioned your book, Bill, but just how like the Biden administration is going to continue this legacy of violence and separations unless he and his team truly and honestly reckon with the mistakes that were made when he was vice president under Obama, and just like the historical nature of and bipartisan nature of this violence. And I got a lot of blowback from Democrats who are very much against Trump's immigration policies, but because this is Biden, they don't want to think about it as much. And so anyway, again, like this is why your work is so important.
And And Gene, the blowback you got, I was shocked. It seemed to come more from Democrats saying, give Biden a chance. You never said this when Obama was president, which, I invite the audience to remember, audience here and on Twitter, that most of the people yelling when Trump was president were also yelling when Obama was president, right? Rare is the person who started specifically with Trump. Like this is, we've been opposing unjust immigration policies for multiple presidencies, even prior to Obama.
I would just say quickly, I think that's in part a product of some kind of historical amnesia among the broader public. I mean, I don't think people really realize how punitive policies were under the Obama administration and before that under George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, et cetera. And that's an important reminder. I mean, I think the biggest danger right now is for the Democrats and the Biden administration to say, let's roll back all the Trump policies, and there are obviously many to roll back, and then call it a day. And we need to go much farther than that. We need to go far beyond that. Obviously, this has been a long broken system that needs to be addressed. And Democrats will need to kind of look in the mirror on that as well, as you bring up in your op-ed, Gene.
So Angela, I wanted to turn back to your work. One of the most important things about your book is that you compare, Escondido, this very restrictive location, with Santa Ana that has more immigrant friendly measures, to show like the real differences that happen at a micro level when you combine local anti-immigration measures with the broader federal landscape. And so you write, you talk about the difference between assimilation and integration, and how restrictive local immigration laws inhibit authentic integration while speeding up assimilation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what your findings looking at Escondido and Santa Ana reveal about the difference.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, assimilation is a dirty word in academia recently, but out there kind of on the streets, and for good reason, because oftentimes when we talk about assimilation, whether or not we're directly or indirectly grappling with it, we're talking about the power of the state and the force of the state to change somebody's own perspective, own way about going about life. And so I thought it was important to highlight the fact that while people that I studied in my work do change their bodies, their behaviors, their minds as a result of being coerced or forced through these really restrictive local level contexts, that we shouldn't champion that. Like, oh, now they're speaking English, this is a good thing. Maybe we should put in force broad restrictions across the United States if this is what we want, language acquisition, for example. And I think that is getting the take exactly 100% wrong, in part because assimilation in this sense is talking about structural and violent force of law that's coercing change. And at the same time, it's negatively impacting well-being at a very deep level, right? The ability of a mother to name their child the way that they would choose to name them, or pushing a young woman to decide on her way home from middle school whether she should go through the back alley, which is where the gang members hang out, or she should go through the front streets, which is where the police and ICE and Border Patrol are often setting up checkpoints. So, I mean, these are impossible situations. And I wouldn't never say that the kinds of assimilation and behavior or language that we might see in these kinds of places are things that we should hold up. And I think in order to make that argument, bringing in comparative data is really critical. And so I looked for a city close to Escondido. So Santa Ana and Escondido are 70 miles apart, but in the same state context, right? So we know that state level matters, laws matter a lot. And in Santa Ana, what I see is, change over time is inevitable with anyone, including immigrants and including people who are born in the United States, right? There's shifts that happen to both groups, but the kinds of shifts that are happening in Santa Ana have much more to do with people organically adjusting to new spaces and new places and new ways of going about their lives, with the idea that they are welcome members of a local community. And I want to give just one example of the way that that might shake out, where there's not this forced rejection of one's racial or ethnic roots or language or the like. And that has to do with civic engagement. So just as I've pushed back against the idea that undocumented immigrants are uniformly in the shadows, I think oftentimes we say, well, undocumented people are civically unengaged because oftentimes we only care about ways of engagement that are out of reach for folks that don't have documentation status. So voting, for example, or naturalization. But that doesn't mean that undocumented people are not civically inclined or don't care about their local communities. It just means that we've made some things out of reach. And so when we look at the ways that people are civically engaged in these two spaces, this restrictive city and this much more accommodating one, in the restrictive city, folks were civically engaged, but they almost had forced blinders on where everything was filtered through the lens of immigration restrictions, and how to push back against that and how to fight and who has voice and who can go speak with the mayor, the police chief and the like. Whereas in Santa Ana, organizing around immigration and immigration rights is important. I would not say it's absent at all, but there's this space where you can dig in and engage in areas beyond immigration specific issues. So for example, I found a lot of activism around the need to bring bike lanes to Santa Ana for day laborers to use en route to pick up spots in front of big box construction stores. And you might say, well, bike lanes, green space, like this is kind of, fluffy subjects that no one really cares about. But in fact, a lot of people are killed on their bicycles. And in fact, green space and bike lanes are a public good that can bring well-being to an entire community. And so when we see undocumented people able to dig into an issue that's important to them, not just because of their immigration status, but because of their status as humans living in a space with other people, I think that speaks volumes to the ways that integration as a full member of a bounded community can look in a place where people are more welcomed. And I also don't want to paint, a welcoming community with a entirely broad brush of being the best, right? There's a lot of problems in these communities, and sanctuary ordinances aren't a panacea for removing all kinds of tensions with the police whatsoever. But there are really important differences between the ways that people both live their lives or engage civically in restrictive versus accommodating communities that have a lot to do with this question of forced assimilation or more organic integration.
Yeah, and these immigrant friendly measures that are implemented at a local level are very much demonized by far right leaders like Stephen Miller, who I write about in Hate Monger, who just make sure it's to go out of their ways to peddle misinformation about these measures and claim that they actually increase crime and that they're, letting loose child abusers on the streets and all of this completely false information that paints immigrants as criminals, and that paints immigrant-friendly laws that actually increase their integration and health and well-being and the well-being of communities overall as being something bad. So anyway, again, like this is why this work is so important. And leaping back into the past, Adam, one of the most disturbing things that I learned from your book was you paint these like really vivid pictures of the private shipping companies that were used for decades to detain immigrants, to deport them, these so-called hell ships that, people were just overcome with seasickness, with terrible food. They were very crowded. There were suicides, people leaping off the ships. There was violence at the hands of immigration officers. Can you talk about that those really horrific conditions and how they're perhaps not so different from the reality that we see today along the border?
Yeah, and certainly many people are familiar with the privatization of immigration detention in recent years and decades. And I kind of took that interest and started researching more about the physical process of expulsion. And what does the physical process of removing someone from the country look like? And I found out that immigration politics wasn't just a question of kind of domestic policy or foreign relations, negotiations between states, but in fact, private interests have long played a crucial role here. And as early as the 1920s, deportation became profitable. And that's, I want to emphasize, because of state policies, right? Specific state policies put in place that turned expulsion into a lucrative business. And obviously the implication being that different policies could lead us to different ends. But private shipping companies, cargo companies, saw deportees, saw human beings as cargo, an opportunity to maximize their profits. So I tell the story of a Mexican shipping company, which I should emphasize as well. It wasn't a US shipping company, but a Mexican shipping company that in the middle of the 20th century transported nearly 50,000 Mexican migrants from Port Isabel, Texas, 550 miles south to Veracruz, Mexico. And they took the deportees in the same ships that they transported bananas back for US consumption, from the Mexican state of Tabasco to places like Alabama. And they treated the human beings as cargo because they considered them essentially as others. They really saw them in a way that I think allowed both, created and furthered the racialization of migrants as non-citizens, and then justified the treatment, the inhumane treatment of them. And US and Mexican officials, really said pretty horrific things that I found in the archives. But it's this combination of profits and punishment that really had a toxic effect. And US officials made no secret of this in a way, even though they said that their efforts to deport people further into the Mexican interior would put them closer to their home, as if it was some kind of humanitarian effort. Close reading of the congressional record shows that the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service Commissioner, Joseph Swing, in the 1950s testified and told Congress that, and I'm quoting him here, and he said, "The Mexicans hate the boat lift like the devil hates holy water. It's the most salutary thing we've hit upon yet." Right? The idea here was to punish people in hopes of discouraging them from returning to the United States. We might think of this as a precursor to later prevention through deterrence efforts, whether it was the militarization of the border and making it more dangerous and ultimately deadly to cross the border, or the separation of Central American asylum-seeking families in the last few years that are strategically designed to get people to stop migrating. What we know, sadly, is that it does not stop people from migrating, but these policies exact an extraordinary physical, psychological, and material cost on migrants. And I think that raises a larger question about, if we're thinking of the immigrant experience, I think there's some also kind of myths in the United States around this. What is the immigrant experience, the American dream, et cetera? And that's problematic in all kinds of ways, but centering the actual physical act of deportation and immigration enforcement in the communities, as I think all three of us do, really points us in a different direction and forces us to reckon with the fact that state-sanctioned trauma has long been central to the so-called immigrant experience.
Right, and from a storytelling perspective, this all goes back to the demonization that we see, and the fact that we have this culture that very much glorifies the white male anti-hero, white men who do bad things are like fetishized almost, and in the meanwhile, like complicated brown and black people are described as animals, as beasts, and so this state-sanctioned violence continues. And I argue in a recent article that, like, until we afford brown and black people the same license to err as white men, they will continue to be dehumanized by our institutions. And so anyway, I just want to thank you all again for your work, which is so important to enhancing this more equal treatment. And I know we're going to be having a Q&A. I had one more question, but I also wanted to offer you guys the opportunity, if there's like a piece of your book that you guys want to read, is that something that we still want to do, or should I leap into my question? Okay.
You can go to the question.
Okay, so I just have one last question. So Biden's immigration plans so far do not seem to address the problem of impunity and the cultural problems within ICE and Border Patrol. Like, there's very much this mentality that we're going to issue memos and directives telling officers and agents to to only prioritize serious criminals, which to me and to all of you surely sounds like just more of the same from what we saw under the Obama era, where there was the alleged prioritization of serious criminals that ended up, agents just did whatever they wanted, and there wasn't real accountability for that. So how do we fix this? Like, what can Biden actually do that will be a more humanistic immigration policy? Do you guys have any ideas about any ideas about specifically addressing the problem of impunity and cultural problems at ICE and Border Patrol? Is abolishing ICE the only true answer? Like, do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Angela, go ahead.
I was gonna say, maybe we should do like a round robin. I'll go really quick, which is just to say, I don't think there's any easy fixes or silver bullets here beyond the abolish ICE. And then, the people will make the question of, well, what takes its place? And that's a whole other conversation to have. I think continuing to think about building firewalls between the police and ICE is really important. But just as we see, physical barriers on the border being breached, these kinds of firewalls between police and ICE are often breached, and relationships across law enforcement, regardless of where one falls in that space, those relationships have a really long shelf life. And I see this in my work in Escondido, which had this program to embed ICE with police Operation Joint Effort. And even after that was undone by California's own legislative effort, you have somebody's phone number on your cell phone, and you sat next to them at a desk at the PD headquarters, and it's really easy just to make a call and have an ICE agent or a Border Patrol agent swing by and check somebody out. So those kinds of firewalls are important, but they're not sufficient. What I would say that would be important in thinking about ICE is potentially, reducing by a huge amount the number of people that would even fall into their purview. And that means a broad legalization program, but one without administrative burdens, additional threat, and even more waiting. So when Biden's plan hit last week, and we could actually kind of look at it and read it, it's proposing an 8-year path to citizenship for almost 11 million undocumented people, with important carve-outs there. But the average age of undocumented people in the United States today is 45. And the average length of residency in the United States for undocumented people is already 15 years. So if we pass Biden's bill tomorrow, which obviously is not going to happen, and eligible immigrants face no obstacles on this path to citizenship, which the terminology I don't really like, we're expecting naturalization probably at age 53 after people have spent an average of 23 years living in the United States. That is not the kind of legalization that I think will help this question around ICE and just the discretionary power given agents. I think something much more quick would be really important, and recognizing the time that people have already put into their communities here in the United States.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I agree with Angela. And I think, we've seen just by any efforts to reform the Department of Homeland Security or, Immigration Naturalization Service before it, have failed, essentially. There's some kind of bureaucratic inertia here, which is part of the reason why, regardless of who's in power, regardless of what kind of top-down efforts they make, there's the question of implementation and just the incredible discretionary power that low-level agents of the state have is problematic on many levels. So minimizing the number of people that come into contact with the deportation machine is the key. And that would include, obviously, a legalization, a broad legalization, as well as provisions for future migrants to come to the United States with authorization, right? And that would be a way to kind of divert ICE's attention away from enforcement, or divert DHS's attention away from enforcement, and perhaps channel more into services. But that's a big open-ended question. In the meantime, obviously, any kind of executive authority the Biden administration has that can leverage on behalf of migrant communities would be really essential. But there's no easy outs here, and I'm really interested actually in hearing from both you, Bill, and Jean, because in your work, in your book, Bill, and your recent op-ed, Jean, you also offer some prescriptive suggestions, which I found really refreshing and really important. So I'd love to hear what you all think.
Yeah, thanks. And I think to echo both of you, Angela and Adam, path to citizenship, certainly, and separation between the police and ICE, I think is critical. But this question also takes me back to when I used to get earlier when talking about my work as kind of like, how do we conduct these immigration and home raids humanely, which always kind of, yeah, you both smirked, right? It always rubbed me the wrong way. Like at their core, these are traumatic, violent tactics. Adam, you worded it the best. This is state-sanctioned trauma, right? And I just want to keep thinking of deportation the same way. Like deportation at its core is an inhumane practice. And the only reason deportation works is because of coercion and because of the threat of violence. People do not leave their homes and their families without the alternative being something catastrophic, right? So, you know, I want to take that with us, that no matter how we think about reframing the immigration system, it's not a matter of necessarily humanizing or making the deportation process kinder, though certainly we don't want to return to things such as you described, Adam, right, in the boat you described. But it's avoiding this fundamentally dehumanizing and violent process altogether.
Right, and this deportation system targets people usually with deep roots in the community, people with kids, people with jobs, homes, who've invested in the community. So it's a real trauma for the families and for the communities involved. And as far as solutions, I mean, the Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal put forth this resolution about having scalable civil consequences for immigration offenses. So instead of you committing an immigration offense, meaning deportation, and you never see your family again, there are instead scalable civil consequences. Like maybe you have to do community service, maybe you have to pay a fine, but it's very much about decriminalizing the immigration system and treating it more like a civil offenses, which is what they really are. So do I do the Q? Should I look at the questions from the audience, or is somebody else doing that?
Oh, I am more than willing to do that for you. Our first question from the audience: does the 14th Amendment grant due process? And does due process have a different meaning in immigration due to the fact that immigration courts are under the executive branch and the Department of Justice and not the judicial branch?
I can jump in quickly. Immigrants and non-citizens do have some due process rights, although these have been really contested throughout history. And there's been long legal battles, in part based on the 14th Amendment, in part, the 4th and 5th Amendment. And, there's not a straight line here. There's no kind of simple solution. And this has been something that's, I think, expanded over time, but through the use of regulatory authority, immigration officials have figured out ways to, limit migrants and non-citizens' ability to, access due process rights. And, they aren't guaranteed, access to representation, legal representation. That could be a big, important change, obviously, to the current system, while recognizing that it wouldn't go nearly far enough. But that is a key question and a debate moving forward. Or what kind of rights do undocumented people, have before the law?
Yeah, and sorry, Angela, go ahead.
Go for it.
Okay, I would also add to that we see in Latino communities, in Black communities, in marginalized communities throughout the US, rights are ignored when a threat is created, right? So when a reaction of an officer or an ICE agent is violence, that often is blamed on the fact that individual feared for their life, and therefore they engage in search and seizure, or they pulled a weapon. So, and this takes us all the way back to the beginning of the discussion. A fundamental way in which we strip people of their rights is to make sure that everybody thinks of them as a threat. And we saw that certainly, Jean, as you cover in Hate Monger with Stephen Miller's language and Trump's language. I think one of the newer additions to the criminalization, especially of Latino undocumented immigrants, was that everybody belonged to MS-13, right? So there was this like machete wielding gang imagery that was cast of these individuals, which therefore kind of justifies violence, quick reactive violence on the part of officers.
Yeah, I was only going to chime in to say that in a lot of destinations that are more accommodating or immigrant friendly, there are efforts, in Chicago and Santa Ana and many places, there's efforts at the local level to provide legal representation for residents who are under deportation proceedings. And those are really, really important. They've garnered much better outcomes for those individuals who are able to tap into those supports. But it's like a drop in the bucket. Even advancing $500,000 towards those efforts per year, as Santana recently did, is just not enough to make an actual change. Now, it's not to say they shouldn't do it, but it's necessary but not sufficient when we're thinking about kind of big gaping holes in due process rights.
And Angela noted some of the grassroots organizing that is taking place. We have several questions about allyship and advocacy on behalf of undocumented communities and families. What should people be doing to bring attention to advocate for, and to contribute to the overall abolition of these systems?
I can start with one that's particularly near and dear to my heart and the advocacy we've done in Washtenaw County. And that is, as I guess everyone here has mentioned, is thinking about the systems that cause people to come in contact with, as Adam calls it, the deportation machine, right? So the more we can limit this contact, the better. And a huge reason that people continue to end up in ICE custody is because they're filtered through jails because of 287G agreements. When we keep people out of jails, we keep them thus out of the deportation machine. So we need more access to driver's licenses. And this is something I say, across the board, some states have access, some don't. But there's always something that could use more advocacy from your local community. And there's a little bit more space to do this because driver's licenses are not, it's hard to make movement federally. It's often easier to make it on the state or the local level. And in the absence of being able to push for driver's licenses, often as we have here, there's local IDs. We have the Washtenaw County ID, the Washtenaw ID. And this is just another way to identify oneself that prevents people from being more likely to go to jail. Because one of the things we see, and Angela covers in this book, in her book as well, is that when folks are asked to identify themselves and they present as Latino and working class, and they show a passport, it often leads to stereotyping, and the officer puts them in jail, and thus, deportation. So more access to identification is helpful in all of these communities.
And as far as allyship, I mean, just not allowing the laundering of white supremacy through narratives about national security or economic prosperity, like being able to identify those arguments for what they are and where they come from is really useful and really important. And so like in my book, Hate Monger, one of the things I tried to do is to connect the dots between the immigration rhetoric, the immigration policy that we were seeing under Trump, and the white supremacist sources that Stephen Miller was directly deriving it from. Like, this is driven by hatred for brown and Black communities, and it is incredibly important for us to recognize that. There's this tendency like, oh, I support legal immigrants. I don't, what I'm really against is illegal immigrants. I'm against criminals. But that false dichotomy is rooted in racism, not necessarily at every individual level, but when you look at how those narratives are used to brainwash people into opposing all kinds of humane immigration policies, it becomes very clear, like what the origins are. And so I just encourage people to push back.
You know, if I was going to make just 2 points to add on to what you all have already said, I think that digging in at the local level, not just because that's where I study, but I think digging in at the local level is the best in many ways, because you can, it's directly in front of you. It's the face of government that most directly impacts all of us when we step out of our doors every day. And there are a lot of good groups and good organizations that are already doing the work. So as people, you know, become interested or want to further their interest in their activism and their work in this space, I would underscore finding the groups that are already doing the work, especially those that are led by immigrants, and supporting that work in the ways that you can be slotted into, either with your time, your money, or your talents. The other thing that I find really important in this space around coalition building and allyship is connecting the dots between past and present. So this is, Adam, this is more of your purview here, but if you permit me, I found very compelling when we were having the conversation about kids in cages, Japanese Americans, descendants of people who experienced the Japanese internment during World War II, speaking out against kids in cages and connecting the dots between the Japanese internment and the incarceration of kids at our border. And I think that those kinds of historical connections can speak to a broader public in a way that forces us to reckon with human rights abuses and trauma and violence that are unfolding in current time, by connecting them to things that we are now collectively ashamed of as a nation, like Japanese internment.
Yeah, I mean, these are really wonderful points. I agree with what everyone said, and I'll just add, you know, I think one of the things I realized doing the research for my book is that, you know, as long as the deportation machine has been around, as I mentioned earlier, people have been fighting back against it, right? It remains vulnerable, right? How it's vulnerable and how to most effectively fight against inhumane policies shifts and changes over time. But people have consistently fought back. And I think oftentimes, one, through broad-based solidarity and sustained struggle. We're not talking about kind of quick victories. We're talking about multi-year, multi-decade struggles. And I think we've actually seen that, despite the fact that the current bill, you know, before Congress is imperfect in many ways, it has the imprint of immigration activists and organizers all over it. And I think we should recognize that, and recognize that, you know, that sustained struggle does go a long way over the course of time in shifting narratives and creating new political possibilities. And, you know, I think that journalists and activists and academics can play a part in that too. And I think, you know, Bill really compellingly shows this in his book, tying back some of the things that Angela just mentioned, in the ways that he was involved writing about this to bring to light how horrific these systems of violence have been, but also participating and helping people in really small, concrete ways that make an incredible difference in people's lives. So whether it's supporting political candidates, donating to organizations that work with immigrant community and immigrant rights, or actually helping people in your local community. There are many ways in which you can contribute.
We have several questions about intersectional coalition and intersectional invisibility, with particular reference to South Asian, Black immigrants, and LGBTQIA+ queer communities. What in your research or experiences offers insight into the possibility of coalition building or other things that need additional conceptual, theoretical, or activist attention, given the diversity within immigrant populations?
Bill, do you want to jump in on this? I mean, this is something you talk about explicitly
Sure.
toward the end of your book, and I think it's a really crucial point.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam, and that's a great set of questions, right? How do we collaborate across groups? I think both Jean and Adam, you pointed to the systemic institutional violence, and one of you mentioned the resilience in our communities. And one of the things that I often find challenging in my work and in people who think about immigration work is sometimes we talk about resilience and we stop our analysis right there. And I encourage folks that every time you see a community or an individual who's resilient, ask what system is forcing them to need to be resilient, right? And sometimes the system that's forcing our undocumented friends and family to need to be resilient is the exact same system forcing our Black community members, our LGBTQ friends and allies to also need to be resilient. I think this was specifically clear during recent uprisings and protests, right, that have been going on, especially following the killing of George Floyd. And what we saw there was protests against the police in DC, specifically patrolled by ICE, right? And we saw protests in Minneapolis, where we got aerial shots from drones, right, provided by the Border Patrol. So the tools of our oppressors it's very clear that the tools of our oppressors are sharing the same tools to monitor what these communities are doing. And I think that really helps me when I'm thinking of solidarity across communities, to think about what system is causing this oppression, no matter how we may identify on an individual level and in what way. One of the things I teach in my class briefly is the idea of the symbolic assailant, which I believe comes from your field, Angela. But the symbolic assailant is something in the police literature. And in the police literature, policing is taught to be very dangerous. So officers need to focus their attention on the most dangerous threat in their environment, right? And so in a racialized US that comes from a history in which the police have enforced slavery and Jim Crow law, the symbolic assailant became the threatening Black man, right? And thus we see quick violent reactions. But this has also taken different shapes throughout, since that point. And we see that the symbolic assailant for a Latino is often, as I mentioned, MS-13 or the narcotraficante. And we see after 9/11 also the terrorist or the Muslim or Arab individual. So these are all different ways of using the same strategy to create this image that our communities are dangerous. And I think what this points to is that there's, as Adam said, there are weaknesses or there are points in this deportation system that we can focus on in our advocacy. And the more we're able to understand the machine that is impacting all of us, the more we're able to focus on those weaknesses together.
And one thing I'll add to that, just because there's also like this tendency to create like this idea of a brown or Black mob, like Trump talking about an invasion at the border. And the reason that solidarity between brown and Black communities is so important and so scary to people on the far right and people who perpetuate racism is because they understand that these communities coming together can illuminate the reality of the white mob and the historical violence of the white mob working in collaboration with law enforcement over the years. Like when you look at like the mobs who have committed the most horrific acts of violence in the history of the United States, it has always been a white mob, as we saw the sort of manifestation of that during the siege on Capitol Hill. But these white supremacists who in positions of power actively work to drive rifts between Black and brown communities. And there's like a whole section on this white supremacist website that inspired a lot of people in the Trump administration about like crimes between Latino or acts of violence between Latinos and Black people, like committing acts of violence against each other and celebrating those acts of violence, because they understand that if these communities actually came together and opened their eyes to the parallels in their experiences of state violence, then that would be a coalition that would be impossible to ignore.
Yeah, just on that point, I want to shout out a friend and colleague's book, Jennifer Jones, who works with Adam at UIC, who's written this book called The Browning of the New South. So as we see, especially Latin American migration entering new destinations throughout the United States, so no longer just concentrated in these traditional receiving locales throughout California, Chicago, Texas, and some Florida, but moving especially to the Sun Belt, places that are oftentimes still entrenched in the Black-white binary. Jennifer Jones's book does, I think, a really, really good job of talking about the ways that those kinds of entrances of new groups can create opportunities for coalition building and shared recognition of systems of oppression, just as Bill spoke about. So Jennifer's got a really nice case study of how this happens on the ground over time.
Thank you for those responses. We also have questions about the privatization of detention centers and surveillance in undocumented communities and the Biden administration's reluctance to disinvest from practices of privatization. Thoughts on those processes overall?
I just have one thing to say, which is a disappointment in the Biden bill, though to Adam's point, I think it's less of a disappointment than it's been in previous attempts to reform immigration system in the United States, which is this continued reliance on what people have called the grand bargain. So in exchange for a broad legalization program, you have to put more money and boots on the ground, especially to the US-Mexican border. We have to continue with enforcement, and it's always sort of this tit for tat. And I was hoping to see that we were beyond that framing of the situation, because the US-Mexico border is highly militarized, as anyone who has been on that border knows. And I think even people who are restrictionist recognize that funneling more money towards the border is essentially a way to potentially win votes for comprehensive immigration reform, but it's not going to do anything tactically to stop people from crossing. If anything, it will increase deaths, as we have seen since the 1990s. And so I too am disappointed in the continued emphasis on border enforcement, though you can see that this is taking a slightly different tenor in this iteration of this bill.
I would just say, I think this is an important question, and there may be a real change here moving forward from the previous administration to this one when it comes to the privatization of detention. I mean, if you look at the stocks for these private detention companies like Geo Group, Core Civic, the days after the last president, was elected, and the days after Biden was elected, they're kind of like a, inverted graph there of, shooting up after, Trump's elected and really just dropping precipitously after Biden's elected. And limiting privatized detention is an important thing to do, but it doesn't go far enough. And here, scholars of the carceral state like Ruthie Gilmore, have made important points about incarceration more generally. That we need to have an imagination beyond private immigration detention and push for the elimination of all immigration detention. And there's all kinds of ways in which that's harmful to human beings and to our communities, and completely unnecessary. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, for good reason, that the number of people detained dropped from more than 50,000 to, I forget exactly what it was, but maybe 19,000 or something like that. I mean, it showed that people do not need to be locked up, right? I mean, that is a political decision, and there's no reason why that needs to continue. And I think the Biden administration has wide leverage, broad leverage there. I hope they use it. And I think we'll need to continue to push for those types of changes, because chances are they're not going to happen without sustained pressure.
And as I invite your closing comments, just a reminder for questions that we didn't get to about the spiritual and cultural toll of navigating this form of legal violence, issues with colorism, assimilation and attempts at assimilation, the trauma of family separation. All of those themes were raised across questions. So if you can speak to any of that in your closing comments, giving the floor to each of you in turn, I'm sure the attendees would appreciate it. Jean, I'll begin with you.
Yeah, it's just been such an honor to talk to all of you guys about this incredibly important work. I think that one of the most disappointing things that could happen as we begin this new administration is that people just think to themselves, well, the nightmare is over, the Trump administration is over, the immigrant communities are safe, we've done our part by getting Trump out of office, and we can just move on with our lives. It's that kind of amnesia that just perpetuates this violence. And like, I remember when I was covering immigration under the Obama administration, and there were the mass deportations, and I was talking to fathers who had lost everything in Tijuana. And I remember thinking, God, like, this situation can't get any worse. I remember walking along the smuggling routes, and every time that I went into the desert, coming across human remains, people who died of dehydration and exposure to the extreme environment, trying to be reunited with their families in the United States. And this is a problem that has been going on for decades. And I remember thinking, like, this can't get any worse. And it got worse under the Trump administration. And I don't think that it's going to get any better unless we persist having these conversations and making demands of our leaders, regardless of political party, and making sure that we're holding them accountable. So yeah, and so that's why I think that these conversations are so important.
Thank you so much. Angela.
Well, I also want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be with you all and to engage in this conversation. I've really learned a lot myself. And I think that as a closing thought, I wanted to throw two things out there. The first, kind of pulling from a scholar of forced migration, who says that there really is no justification for conducting research into situations of extreme human suffering if we don't have the alleviation of that suffering as an explicit objective of our work. And that has been a guiding light for me in the work that I do, and I have come to grapple with it and take it far more seriously over the last 4 years, because precisely what you said, Jean, that you know, it can ratchet up and get worse in ways that we might not have been able to imagine. And speaking of imagination, because, you know, the folks on this panel, and I'm assuming probably a lot of the folks in the audience are engaged in this work and have skin in the game and have heart in the game, I think it's also important to remind us that as we see this extreme human suffering, experience it, study it maybe, or report on it, that we also can't lose the radical imagination of thinking of different systems or different ways of being that would alleviate that human suffering. And so I kind of want to try to hold both of those at once in a sort of closing statement. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Adam.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, and I've learned a lot, both from your work certainly, but being in conversation with you today as well. And I hope we can have more opportunities moving forward. I think one of the things I really admire about all the work that the three of you do, and I certainly try in my own work as well, is that there's real political stakes, right? I think that's important, and there's also possibility for different futures, and I think that that's something that all of our work kind of points to or alludes to. As bad as things are or have been, there's a possibility for different outcomes moving forward, and that doesn't happen magically. That doesn't happen because we elect a different party or a different person. Just because one person has left office doesn't mean that things are going to change overnight. So it does point again to the fact that, as we've all, I think, alluded to or mentioned, right? It's through the sustained struggle over a long period of time, and really solidarity and the struggle for power. I mean, getting back to the question earlier about the threat that broad-based organizing and solidarity poses. I mean, that's what it's about. It's about who has power over these narratives, who has power over these questions of belonging and citizenship. And I think that's a struggle that we need as many people involved in as possible. And I think that's key moving forward. And I hope, as Jean mentioned, that people don't let up now that Biden's in the White House and the Trump administration is behind us. I hope people actually ramp up their engagement and involvement. We need as many people as we can. If you talk with immigration organizers and activists, that's what they always say. They need more people, they need more help, they need more support. And I hope that moving forward, that's what we find, and we all contribute to each in our own way.
Thank you, Adam and Bill.
Yeah, so again, it was an honor really to be able to speak alongside the three of you. So I'm very glad, and hopefully we continue this work and continue to think how we can collaborate across our fields and across certainly journalism and academics. As some closing remarks, I want to take us back to a line that you said, Angela, in the when you compared the two communities, right, and the lack of oppressive immigration law folks are able to advocate more fully for other things, right? And your example was bike lanes, right? And I think about this a lot, and I think about one of my students who was an artist and also happened to be undocumented. And he would do his art that expressed parts of his undocumentedness, right? What life was like for him. And he once told me, sometimes I wish I could just be an artist and didn't always have to be an undocumented artist, right? And it really stuck with me, as does much of this work in your example, Angela, that in these places where folks' identities and health and the way they move about their communities is reduced to their immigration status, it's not only about physical health, it's not only even about being with our families, but it's also about reaching our fullest expression of people as human beings, right? It's about getting to be who we want, to name our children as we want, and to embrace a life that we want without having to reduce our identity to an immigration status because of the oppressive systems. And so the last thing I'll say is a line that I like to start my class off with. We have to love our people more than we hate the systems that oppress them. So many of us are brought to this work by anger and sometimes even by fury at the systems that hurt those we love. And if in some future we manage to dismantle those systems, we should be aware of what kind of world we want to create, right? And I like to leave my students with that, and I want to leave the audience with that as well. What does the world look like after we dismantle these systems that are oppressing us? Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here with all of you.
All right, so I echo the gratitude and thanks of all the attendees being expressed in the chat. We let those thoughts inform our continued service to the symbolically and structurally forgotten. Again, please help us build this and other NCID programming by completing our post-event survey sent to the email you used to register for this event immediately following our conversation. And join us March 22nd at noon for the next Forgotten Bodies conversation themed Remaking a Life Transformation and Resistance Among Women Living with AIDS with author Celeste Watkins Hayes and guests Daphne C. Watkins, Alfred Young Jr., and Vincent Hutchings. I hope you all stay safe and stay encouraged in your continued mobilization for the oppressed. Hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you to our guests.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.